Hello, AP World students. This is Mr. A. Welcome back to school, kind of. I'm glad I can somewhat, I guess, see you guys, or at least hear my voice in this case. I'm just going to go through what the expectations are for quarter four, and then after I'm done going through those explanations, I'll do the lecture. So first up, there's actually 3 documents you should be seeing on Aspen. I'm actually going to be placing most of the modules, in Schoology, but at least the paperwork stuff for everyone to see what they need to do is going to go on Aspen. So the first document you should see right here on your screens is basically just a sample schedule for what's going on. So each teacher every week or 2 is going to give you like modules or basically learning activities that you have to complete by either the end of the week or the end of 2 weeks, depending on what the teacher decides. And basically what the school has set up here was a sample student schedule and basically how you should organize it. Since now you're working at home, this means you have to organize your time. The worst case scenario is, of course, you wait until the last minute, and then all of a sudden you have like 7 different projects all due at the same time on Friday, which is not the scenario we want to do. So remember, the number one thing that we tell students to do all the time, that I've told students to do all the time, is that you need to choose a time during the day and specifically say that is the time you're going to work and try to get something done. Find different parts of the house that are not really too busy where you can work and not get distracted, and just try to get it done. So on the schedule right here, again, you don't have to actually do based off the schedule this way, but you can see it timed off, 9 to 10:30 every day you work, and then from like 1 to 2:30 you work. Again, you don't necessarily have to do this, but this is a sample schedule of what you can do. Here is an overview of the learning modules we'll be doing for AP World History. So if you're looking on here, you see we have 4 learning modules. So first one, the one that we're doing this week, is on the interwar period in World War II. Then we'll do the Cold War. And then after we're done the Cold War, we're actually going to pause for a second. And then for 3 weeks, you can see there's 3 weeks on there, we're going to do activities focusing on reviewing for the AP exam. So that's reviewing the first units 1 through 6, because the AP exam this year is only going to be focusing on units 1 through 6. Unit 6 was the Age of Imperialism. So basically 1900 is your cutoff point. And of course, hopefully you guys all know, DBQ writing is going to be the main thing we're doing for the AP exam. I think it's 45 minutes long that you'll have to do it, and it's 5 documents you'll have to do. So for 3 weeks, that's the main thing we'll be focusing on there. And then to end the school year, you'll have 1 more module. You get 2 weeks to work on it, and then you are done. And every week, or whenever the week comes, is when I'll post these modules. And I'm going to try to base this all out on Schoology. So always look for Schoology for what you want to do. And the last thing I want to show you, this document is on Aspen. This is just giving, especially parents, but also if you guys are getting a little confused as well, what you need to do each week. And every week I will update this on what I'm expecting you to actually get done. So for this week, step number 1, take notes on the interwar period while watching a recorded lecture. This is the recorded lecture, so you are doing it right now. After this lecture is done, you've done taking your notes. There's another assignment on Schoology called Module 1 Webquest. Basically go to that Webquest, it'll send you to a Google form, and basically there you just go through the Webquest, answer questions, and it automatically remembers your answers, and once you've hit the final submit, you're done. It will provide feedback for you once you're done to see how you did with the questions. Some students will ask, do I need to upload anything? And the answer is, for at least this module, Module 1, you do not have to upload anything on Schoology. Just listen to the lecture, take notes, and then do the Webquest. All right, so with that said, we're going to start off with Module 1, which is the interwar period and World War II. Remember, interwar basically just stands for the time period between World War I and World War II, so 1920s, 1930s. And then we'll very briefly talk about World War II. So the essential questions, these are the essential things I'm going to try to answer during this lecture going through here. So we're going to mostly skip over the 1920s. Basically, you just need to know 1920s is going pretty good. But then how did the governments respond to the basically Great Depression when that happened? How did people respond when this natural, this big economic catastrophe happened? And then we're also looking in the middle part, what are some of the changes and continuities that resulted to World War I? If you recall, the Treaty of Versailles ending World War I made a lot of decisions. And several historians, myself included, would say the treaty that ended World War I had laid the seeds to starting World War II about 2 decades later. And then very, very briefly, we'll talk about the consequences of World War II, although that'll be mostly, I think we'll talk more about that next unit during the Cold War. All right, so with that, let's get started. So the first thing you need to remember from World War I is once it ended, the world leaders got together and decided we don't want to have any more global wars. We want to try to prevent all future wars. We want this war to be the end of all wars. If you recall, they do not call it World War I because they didn't know there was going to be a two. They called it the Great War, the war, basically. So they're saying if we get all these people in the room, they can talk to each other. We'll never have this big calamity again. If you recall, the alliance system, Austria-Hungary got in war, Serbia is allied with Russia, France, England. So hopefully they're going to try to prevent that type of scenario from ever happening again. But from the get-go, the League of Nations has a problem. So Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, is the guy who actually proposed the League of Nations to the world. But in the end, the United States did not even join the League of Nations. That's in part because the President is the one who negotiates the treaties, but the Senate is the body that actually confirms the treaties, and the Senate rejects the League of Nations. So the United States, which is going to be becoming more and more so an economic power in the world, is not a member. And as a result of that, the League really has trouble enforcing any decisions they make. So like later on, when someone like Hitler starts taking over territories piece by piece in Europe and the League of Nations tells him to stop, basically Hitler can just kind of shrug his shoulder and keep on going. And the League of Nations doesn't have a lot of tools up its sleeve to stop him. And here's a little political cartoon just kind of highlighting that situation. So you can see you have different countries that joined the League of Nations, Belgium, France, England, and Italy. But the keystone, the thing that would have held it all together, was the United States. And you see we did not join. All right, the second thing resulting from the World War I we want to remember is the mandate system. So the mandate system is the remnants of the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire fought in World War I, it loses in World War I, and the Ottoman Empire actually dissolves. And all that former territory gets divided up mainly between England and France. And they will temporarily control these territories until they're able to function by themselves and form their own governments. And by temporary, I mean they hold on to it for several decades until basically World War II forces them to give it up. On the next slide, I'll show you the territories that gets divided up. But again, it's mostly France and England. And as a result of these pretty much arbitrary lines that these Europeans drew on here, it does cause conflict in the Middle East that we still see today. So again, here's the lines you can see drawn. So in yellow is England. So they got Iraq, Jordan, Palestine, which is modern day Israel, and Lebanon and Syria. And little fun fact for you guys, since we have some history nerds in here. My name, Abi Yunus. My ancestors are from Lebanon. And most of my ancestors immigrated to the United States right after France took Lebanon as a mandate. It's like that's their ticket to run to the United States, and they took it. All right, so we're zooming ahead really to 1929, a lot of these cases, but what are the causes of the Great Depression? Number one, you see in the top left corner, German reparations. So after World War I, the great powers sat down all together and decided that the blame for the war goes 100% on Germany. Now, I would argue that's not necessarily fair on Germany, considering Austria is the one, or even Russia, you could say, is the ones that really started the wars. But nonetheless, they blame Germany, and reparations are basically damages or dues that they owe other people. And that dramatically hurts Germany's economy for the next 2 decades. And if you live in Germany, you remember and kind of resent those foreign powers for causing, this, basically blaming you and destroying your economy as a result of it. And they did other things like, greatly reduced Germany's military. Another thing that happens in the 1920s that causes the Great Depression to spread is the United States starts growing as an economic power, which means that when the economy of the United States starts falling apart, a lot of those loans and stuff also starts affecting Europe as well. And actually, while the Depression was certainly very bad in the United States, the worst depression in the 1930s actually happened in Germany, not the United States. You can see other things on here. I like to point out during the 1920s, the excess of credit basically just means people started taking more risk with loans in the 1920s because everything was going awesome. And then all of a sudden, when the economy tanked all of a sudden, a lot of people declared bankruptcy, including banks. And I would argue the Great Depression didn't really end until the 1940 when the World War II started, when manufacturing started to ramp up for the war. So really, for most people, the Great Depression, I should say, lasted for about about a decade, I would say. So some of the effects of that: high unemployment. Banks would fail because banks were not backed by the federal government. And as like I said, they could give out loans and then people wouldn't be able to pay back that loan. Also, banks would invest in the stocks, probably a little too risky investing in the stocks. And so what happens is a lot of banks ends up failing. So imagine if your great-grandparents, this is more your great-grandparents generation, they would put money in the bank and then all of a sudden the bank loses all its money, your money, and goes belly up. That causes a lot of people to not trust banks. And I will say, you'll talk more about this again next year in U.S. history. What happened as a result of the Great Depression is the federal government actually backs the money in banks. So if the bank does go belly up, the federal government does choose to help you. That doesn't exist in the 1930s. That's something more today. But imagine with all this horrible economics going on in the 1930s, that results in people start looking around and trying to figure out how we're going to get out of this problem. And as a result, they start looking to people who sound very confident, and they'll just like, we'll follow you, even if we don't necessarily, believe, or maybe like I said, your beliefs are not exactly logical, I would argue. And that's hinting at right there in the bottom right-hand corner, the Nazi Party. Hitler starts rising to power, and one of the number one things he blames is Jews as causing this economic collapse. He also blames the current government, the Democratic government, of giving in when the Germans would actually win. And it's really our government's fault that we lost. And if only we can just basically be militaristic, we can gain our natural place again in European society. So here's just a graph, and you see right here the stock market just showing that dramatic fall that happened. It did go up briefly. You can show it here in this graph, but then eventually it goes down again. There's a lot of up and downs. Like I said, I would argue the Depression didn't really end until World War II started. All right, so moving along, I'm just going to talk about a few of the dictators that rose out of the 1930s, again, out of this desperation. Authoritarians can seize power. So first authoritarian would be Adolf Hitler. He believed in fascism. Fascism is the idea where basically everyone gives everything they have to the government. It's not basically what the government can do for you. It's what you can do for that government. And of course, in the fascist extreme case, in this case, if he believes Jewish people are hurting the government, then we need to get rid of the Jews. And eventually, we'll talk about in World War II, the final solution, the genocide that happens when that's what he wants to do, get rid of all Jewish people. But most people don't know this. Hitler actually seizes power in the early 1930s. So he's actually in power in Germany for several years before World War II actually starts. Very famously, the Olympics was held in Germany when Hitler was in power. All right, next dictator we're going to talk about is Joseph Stalin. So if you remember during World War I, there was a Russian Revolution that overthrows the Tsar, and then the Soviet Union gets put up with Vladimir Lenin. Lenin dies in the early 1920s, and the person who eventually takes over for him is Joseph Stalin. And again, you're just getting more and more entrenched communism going on there, although I'd say it's communism with an authoritarian leader going on here, which is Stalin. Some of the things that I'll highlight for you that he does is 5-year plans. Essentially, it just means we need, he would say, like, we need certain amount of production of steel by the end of 5 years, make it happen. And what would happen a lot of times in this economy, in the Soviet economy, even during the Cold War, is yes, they would make that amount of steel. However, they wouldn't necessarily make it efficiently. The other thing we could talk about is collectivization, which essentially means they just take all the peasants, put them on one big farm. It's like we together as a collective can make the amount of goods that everyone needs. You can see right there in this picture, there's a wonderful propaganda poster saying how wonderful this is. However, we can argue in practice that doesn't necessarily is the case. We'll talk a little bit more about that again next week. The last thing I'll mention for Mr. Stalin is the Great Purge, and essentially under his reign, he is a dictator. So if anyone decides to go against his reign or thinks could go against his reign, he purges them, which means he could exile them into Siberia or even kill them. One of his main rivals, Trotsky, was actually exiled to Mexico and then mysteriously got killed. We don't know if Stalin was involved in it, but it's hard to imagine he was not involved in it. So this is really just a quick summary slide. Again, Germany rallies around fascism. Basically, everything goes to the government. Whereas the Soviet Union, in theory, is communism, although I'd argue they're not necessarily communist. They have authoritarian going on here. And that picture right here, I think that's a picture from when I Google Great Purge. This is what comes up, trying to get rid of all Stalin's rivals. The other countries we'll mention really briefly when going into dictators First, we got Japan. During the 1930s, they turned to basically growing their military and making it very, very strong. And as a result of the industrialization they actually start invading other countries, namely Korea and Japan. Manchuria is part of China, not Japan. And actually, the invasion of Korea and Japan, China starts in like 1930. So if you listen to a lot of historians for Japan and China, they would argue World War II doesn't start in 1940, which is when Europeans say it start. They could even push it back to about 1930 for them. The other leader we'll talk about, you should know, is Mussolini in Italy. He actually was the fascist leader who started before Hitler. In many cases, Hitler actually looked at Mussolini as a kind of role model on how he can make a fascist government. And one of the things that Mussolini did to seize power, once again, he says, I will make Italy strong and powerful once again, just like we were with Rome. So follow me and I will lead you to glory once again. And one of the things he does to cement that status is he invades Ethiopia. If you remember in the late 1800s, age of imperialism, Italy tries to invade Ethiopia but fails. So in the 1930s, Mussolini comes in and actually does conquer Ethiopia. One thing I just want to briefly mention, just because I want this on your radar, Japan, when they did invade China, I think the Nanking Massacre happened in late 1937 to early 1938. Basically, the Japanese came into the capital city of China and ruthlessly killed civilians. I think some estimates say it was 200,000 people died. Some even put it up to 300,000 people died. But either way, it was very, very brutal. That happened there during the Japanese invasion of China. So, quick review before we move on to World War II. Tojo is the emperor of Japan. You got Hitler for Germany. Mussolini is in charge of Italy. And then we have Joseph Stalin in charge of the Soviet Union. All right, so now here comes my very, very brief World War II thing. So what causes World War II? I'd say the number one is aggression of totalitarian powers, basically those dictators, especially Germany. Hitler starts taking more and more pieces of territory from the parts of Europe. And usually the Allies, you can see the middle green one right there, try to do appeasement, which basically just gives in to Germany. Germany wants parts of Czechoslovakia, fine, give it to them if it avoids war. Germany wants the Rhineland, fine, let them have it. But eventually, the Allied powers realize that appeasement is failing, and eventually when Hitler invades Poland is when France and England finally decide they actually have to do the war. There's other things mentioned in here, rise of nationalism, United States being isolationist, the League of Nations not being able to do anything. And the last one, as I mentioned, I think earlier in the top right corner, that Treaty of Versailles that was unfair to the Germans, which of course they held that resentment and they want to basically become strong once again. All right, so here's a map of World War II, and I guess I'll summarize it very, very quickly. So you can see right here, Germany's in the middle of Europe. They have the Soviet Union on their east coast and France on the west side. This map is actually in the middle of the war. You see Warsaw right there in the middle. Poland used to exist, but what actually happened in the beginning of the war is Soviet Union and Germany were actually allies, and they actually split Poland in half. And that kind of worked, Soviet Union and Germany being allies for at least about a year, I think. But then Hitler basically decides to betray Stalin, and Hitler invades the Soviet Union. And if you're looking on this graph and you're looking closely, you see, generally speaking, the war went really good for Germany up until about 1942. Germany pushes all the way through the Soviet Union, all the way up to Stalingrad and Moscow, and they conquer France. France gets completely conquered. Whatever remains of France actually ends up running to Great Britain. It's not until really 1943, when the United States has officially entered the war and started sending troops over, that the tide starts turning. The Soviet Union starts slowly pushing back on their front. And of course, you can see right there in the little tiny thing right there, Normandy, when we actually do invade France and start retaking it, that didn't happen until June 1944. And then from that point, basically from the Soviet Union and then from the United States and England on one side, we just all converge into Germany. And again, this is a very rough timeline. We're not actually going to talk about any of the battles. I will briefly talk about Blitzkrieg because I want you guys to know what Blitzkrieg is. Essentially what that is, Germany uses a lot of their advanced technology, tanks and airplanes, to very, very quickly attack and overwhelm their force before their enemy even has a chance to respond. Very famously, Hitler is able to take over France in about a month, and I think they're able to take over Poland actually in about a week. I think Warsaw takes about a month too. But generally speaking, they're able to take over several countries very, very quickly in about a month, which is overwhelming. I'm not a German person myself, but I think Blitzkrieg roughly translate to lightning war. Battle of Britain is basically when Germany bombs England. You can see, as I mentioned before, Hitler tries to invade Soviet Union. It initially goes well, but in Stalingrad, right there in the middle, it starts stalling out. And I'll just jump ahead. Eventually, guys, I mentioned before, victory, VE Day means victory in Europe, and VJ Day means victory in Japan. And I guess very controversially, the war in Japan ends with the dropping of the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Here's just some quick pictures. I just want to point out, I guess the main one I want to point out is the top left corner. I think that's from the Battle of Stalingrad. So one of the reasons why the tide turned in that Battle of Stalingrad, if you can't tell, those people are wearing winter clothing and it is snowing. So Germany, they were not prepared. They were prepared for a very quick war, but once winter really started putting in, that's when a lot of those German forces started getting decimated. All right, on another topic we want to talk about, this is kind of World War II related, but also goes into other than just World War II, is the genocides that happened in the 20th century. So the first one I want to point out is the Armenian genocide. The Armenians were an ethnicity in modern-day Turkey when the Ottoman Empire was in power. And during World War I, the Ottomans considered them enemies of the state, so there was a genocide that happened to those people. If you're following the news, you should know earlier this year, our Congress actually condemned Turkey for the Armenian genocide. And if you had asked Turkey today, did the genocide happen, they would say, no, it never happened. They don't know what you're talking about. I've already mentioned the rape of Nanking. I just want to point out as another example of a genocidal activity that happened with Japan. And of course, the most pungent one that you should all know is the Holocaust, Hitler's final solution, quote unquote, to the Jewish problem. And most soldiers, most United States soldiers, when we did free concentration camps and they saw the horrors of the Holocaust, most soldiers did not believe what they were seeing. They heard rumors of these concentration camps, but when they actually saw it for real life, it was horrific. All right, so what are some of the end results of World War II? So one is, you see Geneva Convention, we actually start outlining things about the rules of war, what we're allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do in war. And one of the top things on the list was maybe we shouldn't kill innocent civilians in the war. We should try to make our best effort to avoid doing civilians. The Nuremberg trials is something that you will talk about, I know, again next year, is when we put Germans and Japanese generals on trial for their war crimes, especially the Holocaust. And like I said, that's when a lot of these details of the atrocities of the Nazis got put on world display with it in Nuremberg in Germany. Other things you want to keep track of, if I go back down to one of those greenish points down there, the Japan actually gets occupied by the United States and starts to become a democracy and becomes a capitalist society. And we always like to talk about today, Japan is a very, very strong economy, and we like to take credit for that. And last but not least, due to the horrors of the Holocaust, the mandate, the Palestine, is given to the Jewish people, and we have the creation of the State of Israel. So here's just some pictures showing you're talking about. Top left shows you the destruction of World War II. Like I said, a lot of these European countries were absolutely decimated as a result of here. And the United States, actually, we somewhat benefited economically. And one of the reasons why we're able to become a world power is because our allies were so decimated, they needed our loans to try to rebuild. And we did that with a thing called the Marshall Plan. The top right, you can see that's the Jewish flag. Bottom left is the creation of the United Nations. So this is basically the League of Nations, except the United States is actually part of it. And again, the United Nations' main job is to prevent future wars. And I guess we haven't had a huge global war, so maybe you can call it successful, although there's still a lot of criticism today that United Nations really still doesn't have a lot of power. On the last picture on the bottom right, you can see that's just, I think that's taken from the Nuremberg trials. These were televised trials. It's mostly focused on those German atrocities for the Holocaust, but it also technically, those trials do extend to other things as well. All right, so that concludes your lecture. I'm just going to explain what you need to do next with our guided practice. So what I need you to do now is there should be another assignment on Schoology for your Interwar/World War II Webquest. So you need to go to that Webquest, click the link, it'll send you to a Google form, and then from there you just answer different questions. And again, you don't have to actually upload it into me. Once you're finished answering those questions, it should give you feedback on how you did, and I should be able to see what you're doing on my Google page yourself. Again, you don't have to actually upload anything yourself. It remembers for you. Once you have it submitted, there is feedback for your answers, so you can see how I answer the questions. You can compare what you're doing. I know there's also a Kahoot you can do when you can compete against each other. That should be fun. Also on Thursday, I think at 2 o'clock I'm saying, I will host a live chat on Teams where if you guys have any questions for me, I can help you guys out. Also, a little bit later on, during that live chat, I can actually try to do a live version of Kahoot, a different Kahoot, so you guys can have fun playing and reviewing. As usual, if you guys have any questions, please feel that you can send me a remind or send me an email. All right, thank you guys. Take care. Have a good week.